Hey guys, Otaku here, back with another competitive Yu-Gi-Oh video, and today we're doing another tier list. So, as I said, Rage of the Abyss comes out next week as of recording this video, and there's some things in the upcoming format that we kind of need to just keep an eye out for. One thing I really want to mention is that I do think that we are going to see the return of 60-card pile decks. Not only did Grass come off the ban list in the most recent Forbidden Limited list, but we also are just seeing a lot of decks run a bajillion engines. We've already seen a deck known as Fiend Pile or even Fiend Link, which is just Yubel with Fiendsmith and a bajillion other fiends, but we are just overall seeing a lot of decks run a lot of engines that don't really synchronize with each other, but they all just result in outrageous end boards. We of course are seeing the all well-known Fiendsmith engine, but we are going to, in Rage of the Abyss, see an Azamina engine, something that if people can get away with running Black Witch, they're going to just run the Azamina engine so that way they can get Omni Negates on the board. But not to mention, I've also seen decks being experimental with the Yubel engine, even a Tenpai engine, a Snake Eye engine, just an engine-focused format all around. We even see like Chimera and Branded running, of course, Patchwork engine, which other decks that can use fusions can also maybe abuse. And before we do jump on over to the tier list, I do want to remind you all that if you're not already supporting the channel and you're not already subscribed, consider leaving a like on this video and subscribing to the channel so I can continue to make videos like this one. All right, so this tier list is mainly a prediction of what I think we're going to be looking at going into the next format. We have the best deck in the room. There will probably be one or two decks up here. Meta contenders, these are decks that are going to be able to put up a good fight, get a good amount of tops either at a YCS or regional. Rogue, these are decks that with good pilots can get tops at regionals and possibly one or two like clutching in on YCSs. And unknown, the unknown category is like decks that I'm uncertain how they're going to be standing. Just real quick spoiler, I'm going to put the Atlanteans in the unknown category. I forgot to put the image for like the new Mermail Atlantean support, so it would go in unknown because I'm not fully certain what that deck is capable of going into the next format, aside from the fact that a lot of people are saying it's not going to be as good as originally expected. And unlike other tier lists in the past where I've gone over a bajillion decks that have been relevant over the last like 3 or 4 years, we're really only going over the decks that have been relevant over like the last year and a half, or in Sprite's case, there's a couple exceptions. These are mainly decks that have been consistently topping regionals or higher over the last year-ish or so, or decks that are even getting support in the upcoming set ROTA, or just decks that have really been popping off recently. But we, of course, are going to start with the biggest elephant in the room, and that is Fiendsmith Snake Eye Azamina, or Snake Eye Azamina, or just Snake Eye in general. Snake Eye has taken a bit of a backseat to Yubel in the most recent format because the Forbidden Limited list really hurt Snake Eye's grind game. Well, thanks to Black Witch being a card that is just automatically by default run in Snake Eyes, the Azamina cards gave this deck another boost in the right direction, allowing it to reclaim its throne as the best deck in the room. This probably will be by no competition because they're going to have an Omni Negate. Something that we removed when we got rid of Baron and Borreload, but they decided, nah, we're just going to give another Omni Negate back to this deck. I think with the hit to Snake Eye Ash and Poplar, the deck is still going to be somewhat tame. It's going to be a lot easier to prevent this deck from setting up boards, especially if they don't open Black Witch, or if they open Black Witch, but they have to kind of come to a decision on if they want to search out Deception or OSS. But this is also kind of the start of what I was talking about at the beginning of the video, where there's 60 card piles. I've seen a handful of people that are testing for ROTA format, testing a 60 card pile, Fiendsmith, Snake Eye, Azamina, Adventure, Board Breaker, or just a bajillion hand traps kind of style deck, because thanks to the wonderful card that is going to completely reshape the format, Fuaros, a lot of decks can kind of get away with this. Fuaros is going to completely change the format, kind of like how the OCG is completely revolving around Max C. Our format's going to revolve around Fuaros, and a lot of decks are going to just need to be prepared for if that card resolves. But this also means that 60 card pile decks aren't completely terrible, because if your opponent plays into Fuaros, you're going to draw into what you're looking for eventually. Next is going to be Tenpai. Tenpai is going to also be one of the best decks in the room, if not the best deck in the room. It's probably going to be Snake Eye's biggest contender because Fuaros, again, unlike a lot of other decks in the format, Tenpai is going to heavily benefit from Fuaros more than every other deck in the format because Tenpai wants to go second, meaning that they are going to main deck Fuaros, get away with it, and they're going to resolve it. Fuwaros is also just going to allow Tenpai to easily find their field spell or find the one Prod of Prosperity that's going to allow them to search it or find the terraforming or the set rotation or whatever they're going to need to get to their field spell. Fuwaros is also going to allow them to find Raigeki and plenty of other resources that's going to help them crack your board so that way they can OTK you. So again, Tenpai is probably going to be the biggest contender in the upcoming format against Snake Eye Azumina. And then the last of the heavy hitters in the most recent year is going to be Fiendsmith Yubel. I don't know if Yubel is going to be running the Azumina cards. They can't really benefit from it as much as Snake Eye or some of the other decks can because they are kind of just a fiend pile deck. That being said, I do think Yubel is going to take a bit of a back seat now that the Azumina cards are out, because there's going to be a lot of decks that are going to be able to crack through what Yubel can put out. And it's going to be a lot harder for Yubel to put up boards now that there are Omni Negates in the game again. That being said, this is still a very powerful deck and something to not take lightly. This deck is very, very strong still. Next, we're going to talk about Fire King. So Fire King not only has the ability to be pure now, but Snake Eye Fire King also got a bit of a boost because the Ulcanix, or Occassion, however you want to pronounce it, is being released in the Rage of the Abyss. This card is the reason that Fire King can be played pure pretty easily now and be a very good meta contender as pure, but Snake Eye Fire King having the Ulcanix also just heavily bumps the deck up in the right direction, makes the deck a little bit less of a brick fest in a sense. It is also going to be a heavy meta contender. I'm sure plenty of people who play Master Duel currently also know how powerful this deck is because Ulcanix has been in Master Duel for about a month now. Branded is still branded. I don't really got to talk about branded all that much. Branded is going to be able to still do branded things, do the puppet lock, or do several other locks or shenanigans, because this is a deck that heavily benefits from going second and cracking a board and playing through a bajillion hand traps if they go first. Branded is also one of the few decks in the format I think that's going to be able to very easily play under Fuwaros. Fuwaros, of course, makes it so that your opponent draws a card every time you special from your main deck or extra deck, and the deck does a lot of specialing from the extra deck, but it doesn't do a whole lot of specialing from the main deck. It does a lot of specialing from the graveyard or the hand. Not to mention, on top of that, they can set up a board that is very minimal at the end phase, but it is huge on your draw phase. Branded does most of their summoning on your turn, but not to mention, they can just end on a very minimal board and set up the rest of the puppet lock on your draw phase where you are unable to counter it because of Branded lost, and Fuwaros is no longer going to draw you any cards at that point. But at the same time, they could just heavily play under Fuwaros because if they puppet lock you, all those cards in your hand ain't going to do much. Centur-Ion's, I think, is going to be an interesting deck. I want to say it's a meta contender because the new support is really good. One of the new monsters can be searched off of Bonfire, which is interesting. Not to mention one of their current monsters can be searched off Bonfire. However, the deck did still lose its ultimate win condition, which was the Calamity Lock. It does still have the Blazar Dragon, which is very powerful, but I don't think this deck is going to be like super crazy. I am going to say it's rogue with the idea that it could still be very much a meta contender in the current format. Now we're going to move on to my favorite deck of all time, Chimera. One thing to know about the ROTA format is that any deck that can heavily abuse the Azumina cards to their fullest is going to have a heavy advantage in the upcoming format. And thanks to the fact that all the Azumina monsters are illusions, Chimera can already right out the gate use them. However, that being said, some of the Azumina monsters can even be made naturally with Chimera Fusion or Polymerization from the Chimera deck. And thanks to the fact that Chimera Fusion is in fact a quick play spell, they can make these cards on your turn. Chimera Fiendsmith Azumina is a deck that I have been toying with for about 4 or 5 weeks now, just constantly playing multiple different hands, tweaking the builds, learning all the lines, and this deck is insane. Not only is the end board absolutely powerful, but the ability to break boards is insane. The cool thing about Chimera is that it doesn't have to break a full board. It has to expend all the irrelevant effects on your opponent's board and then just crash into the lowest attack point monster 4 or 5 times with the same monster. Not to mention, on top of that, Diabell's is just a powerhouse of a card, kind of countering a lot of the board breaker style cards that we are seeing going into the next format. Diabell's just outright counters evenly matched and the Forbidden Droplet, but also prevents your opponent from draw phase imperming you because, again, it's a trap card. The only major counter to this deck is Dark Ruler No More, and even then, they can kind of just set up a set Chimera Fusion, activate it, and then use Desiree to negate the Dark Ruler no more. I think going into the next format, Chimera is going to be heavily more of a branded style deck now. It's not going to be playing as many hand traps, and it's going to be playing a lot of board breakers because the deck, again, has a very good potential of just breaking boards by out-resourcing your opponent's effects. And because of that, I'm putting it up in the meta contenders, and I would go as far as say this deck is going to be tier 1. Now, I could be coping, but I have, again, been playing this deck a lot before the Azamina cards came out, so I do know the potential of Chimera Fiendsmith alone, but on top of that, Azamina is just going to increase the power level even more. But for those who can't afford the Azamina cards, because Deception will be probably a $60, $70 card, and the Fiendsmith cards are still expensive as it is, we still will have Chimera Melodious as an option, and because of that, I'm going to put Chimera Melodious as a rogue option. Chimera Melodious is still really good. The Melodious engine is very powerful. It helps you set up crazy boards. However, the hit Appaloosa has lowered the power level a little bit. They still end on Vortex Dragon, which is an Omni Negate, which could just be the substitute for Azamina Silvera. However, this version of the deck struggles going second. So if you lose the die roll and you have to go second, you might struggle. Gimmick Puppet FTK, I still think is a meta contender. The fact that there is just going to be an Omni Negate of Azamina Silvera running around the format everywhere is going to make this deck struggle a little bit more. However, if we have learned anything after the Forbidden Limitless, is this deck is still very capable of performing the FTK uninterrupted. This deck has essentially just put in a bunch of cards that allows them to get to the field spell, and the field spell is the 1-card FTK. So if they can get to the field spell and resolve the field spell, they're pretty good. So Kashtira, I don't know why I put Kashtira in here. The image isn't supposed to be here. It's more of an engine now more than anything. I've been seeing Kashtira in Pearly, obviously Snake Eye, Mimighoul. The Kashtira has just been being run as an engine. So I'd have to say Kashtira as a deck is going to be rogue because they can still do very strong end boards. Kashtira beatdown and Kashtira control is still very much a thing, but I don't think it's going to be able to keep up. Droll and Lockbird is going to be heavy in this upcoming format, and because of that, Kashtira just plays into Droll and Lockbird. So as an engine, it's even going to probably fall out a little bit, but the deck is still powerful, and I will give it that. Melodious, I think, is going to be a pretty good rogue option. Melodious, of course, still has the heavy power boost that it got from the Legacy of Destruction set. The deck is still very good. However, again, this is a deck that does struggle going second, but it does have a lot of room for non-engine, and thanks to the Azamina cards, you're probably going to be running up to, 15 to 21 hand traps. However, as I mentioned, we're kind of running into a format where we might want to be running more board breaker style cards, or cards that can be flexed as going first or second, either as hand traps or as board breakers, like Forbidden Droplet or Book of Eclipse. Mimighoul is getting some actually really good support in this upcoming set. This is going to be one of the first TCG archetypes in a long time that the second wave support is actually good enough to give the deck a boost. The problem is this deck is going to struggle in a manner that is not expected. So the biggest issue this deck has been facing on the first wave of support is that the Black Witch can just send the face down monster you have on your board to the graveyard, and then you are no longer under the lock from the field spell. However, on top of that, we will be seeing a new hand trap released in this new set called Dominus Impulse, which makes it so if you activate it from your hand, you cannot use the effects of earth monsters for the rest of the duel. The issue for a Mimighoul player is if their opponent activates Dominus Impulse from their hand at any point in the duel, none of your Mimighoul monsters on their board can activate their effects when they're flipped because all the Mimighoul monsters are earth monsters. That being said, your opponent still has to see Dominus Impulse, so because of that, this deck still plays a good chance into being good in this current format. I do think it plays very well under the Fuaros, something that a lot of these decks will struggle in the next format because of the fact that a lot of these decks are just heavy combo decks. They want a special summon from their X deck. They want a special summon from the main. And Mimighoul can kind of play under Fuaros pretty well because they actually do very well under minimalistic boards. So for now, I'm going to put this in Rogue with the idea that it could be a heavy meta contender. Again, the biggest thing that's holding this back is a lot of the decks in the upcoming format will be running Dominus Impulse because they don't have to worry about light, earth, or wind. But not to mention the fact that they can just run Dominus Impulse as a counter to the Rogue option of Mimighoul also helps. All right, so Memento. This is Memento Fiendsmith, but Memento Pure is also just as good. It's just the Fiendsmith engine gives this deck a lot more gas, just being able to set up a Caesar, have a stronger end board. I still think it's going to be a meta contender. It may struggle going second more because of the Omni Negate, but this deck is still going to be able to set up strong end boards going first, and they can prevent the Azamina cards from hitting the board. If they activate Deception, you can just use the Fusion monster to pop the Deception before they can get the Azamina spell cards. Next is Pearly. Pearly is interesting, actually. As we saw in the most recent YCS, Pearly still has a place in the current format. The thing is it needs a good pilot, and it recently has been running the Cash engine because the Kashtira monsters are level 7. They can hard make rank 7s. And wouldn't you know it, Noir is a rank 7. So they could hard make a Noir and just kind of get a monster off the board and try and go for game. That being said, I think with an Omni Negate being thrown around everywhere, again with the Azamina Silvera, this deck is going to struggle where it's always struggled, and that is going second. The perks of Pearly is that the deck is incredibly cheap now, thanks to all the reprints from the Megatins, but also in Rarity Collection 2. This deck is very cheap, so because of that, I think this deck is a good rogue option, possibly a meta contender, but I think meta contending is a coping thought. Rescue Ace is kind of in the same boat as Pearly. The thing is, Rescue Ace has a lot more gas going first and has a lot more gas going second. It can play around with the Fiendsmith engine. It can play around with Azamina to an extent because they were already running the Wanted package as it is. This deck, I think, is at like the bottom of meta contenders because if you were going to be playing a fire deck, why not just play Fire King, which has a heavy power boost, or Snake Eye? And I think the answer to that question is Rescue Ace is a lot cheaper. Plant Link, as we saw at the most recent YCS, is also still a dominant force. For some reason here in North America, we just don't play this deck as often, but in like EU, this deck is just terrorizing the European countries for some reason. And I think it may just come down to play style, but this deck is still very strong. I think it just requires a good pilot. And because of that, I'm going to put it at like bottom of meta contender because I think this deck is just heavily unexplored by the right players. Ritual Beast, I think, is still going to be one of the best decks. It's a shifter deck. It is probably the best shifter deck until Malice comes out. And on top of that, it just sets up Protoss, calls fire, and wins the game against most of the best decks in the room. Or it can call Dark and then just not care about Yubel. It's strong. And not to mention, it can set up Colossus, which counters a lot of other decks like Chimera, Fire King, Kashtira, Gimmick Puppet. It does a lot. Dragon Link. I haven't talked about Dragon Link in a hot minute. However, the new Metamorph cards brought out a card that heavily helps this deck. That being said, I don't know. I don't know enough about the Metamorph cards and how it helps the combo. I just know it does help the combo. I know it helps the end board a little bit. But aside from that, I'm not fully certain. I think the end board now has an Omni Negate, which is good because they did lose Borreload, so getting that Omni Negate back helps the deck. But I am not knowledgeable enough in the Dragon Link department to be able to really tell where this deck is going to stand in the upcoming format. So if you are a Dragon Link player, please feel free to comment down below and educate me and the viewers. Sharks. Sharks will be interesting. I think Sharks will be good until we figure out what they do. Sharks have the ability to set up, I think, 2 or 3 Toads. I know for a fact they can set up 2 Toads with their current form, but with the new support, I think they'll be able to set up a 3rd Toad, which will be interesting to see. But other than that, I don't really know what this deck does. I just don't think what I do know is going to be enough for it to be able to skyrocket. Just rank 4 Turbo is interesting, which I think will help this deck a lot. There's a lot of good rank 4s, but also Abyss Shark is just a free card, a free Xyz. Silent Honor Arc, Silent Honor Dark are good cards as well. I think this deck will be a good road deck at the very least. Six Samurai, I don't know enough. I just know, the only thing I know about Six Samurai is that every time this card is good in the format, nobody likes it, nobody has fun. So we're gonna hope this deck is not good enough to make a difference in the format. But again, I don't know enough about the deck to really gauge where it's going to be in the format. Sprite, all I gotta say is I think it's going to be a good rogue option. I think this is a deck that will continue to get tops because the end boards are really strong. Totally Awesome, Sprite Double Cross, plenty of the Melfi cards. Like this deck does good stuff. It has good end boards, doesn't do that great going second, but I think this deck will continue to top regionals. maybe clutch one out at a YCS, but that might be stretching it. Voiceless Voice. This deck got I wouldn't say a power boost, but because all the other decks got toned down in the current Forbidden Limited list, Voiceless Voice has been able to keep up again. It's been getting toppings again. That being said, I think it'll still be a meta contender in the next format because it's one of the decks that can already set up an Omni-Negate in Engine without the Azamina cards. And I just think, again, this deck is going to be able to keep up in the next format. Vanquish Soul, bottom of Rogue. I would go as far as to say just don't bother. These cards are kind of getting power crept out of the game. It's a good Rogue deck. It's cheap because of the tins, but it's telegraphed. That being said, there is always that one Vanquish Soul player that clutches out a topping at like a YCS or at a regional. So this deck's going to continue to do stuff because good pilots are good pilots. And then we have White Forest Runic mainly. It's going to continue to be a meta contender. It's just a very strong deck. I think with the Azamina cards, this deck actually has the potential to run the Azamina engine because they are already running the light spellcasters, so they can possibly hard make the Azamina cards if they like incorporated some sort of fusion card or something. But this is White Forest Runic we're talking about, so they're not going to be doing that. This deck is one of the few decks that can just run skill drain and get away with it because they can shut it off whenever they feel like it. And I forgot to put it in here somehow, but Runic Stun, it's still a meta contender. It's running a bajillion floodgates with the Runic engine, so a lot of drawing potential. The downside to the deck is that if they don't see the floodgates, they just lose. But that's all I have for you guys today. This is my prediction of what the upcoming format is looking like. If I forgot a deck that is not on here and I haven't mentioned on why it's not on here because I most likely forgot, please let me know in the comments down below, and also let me know where you think that deck is going to stand in the upcoming format. But also, again, be sure to leave a like on this video, and if you're not already and you like competitive Yu-Gi-Oh content, consider subscribing to the channel so I can continue to make videos like this one. But with that, I'll see you all in the next video. See ya.